In this problem, we're told that a survey of 113 high school students determined whether they used Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. And then we're given information about how many used each form of social media. So we're told 69 used Instagram. But I don't want to start with that information because I have 4 different areas possible for people who used Instagram. Maybe they only used Instagram. Maybe they used Instagram and Facebook but not Twitter. Or maybe Instagram and Twitter but not Facebook. Or maybe they used all 3. So I know that there are 69 total for this circle, but I don't know how many for each individual section. What usually happens in these problems is that you want to start at the very end. And if I look at this, it says 22 used all 3 of those forms of social media. So I'm going to put 22 in the center of my Venn diagram. Next, I look at how many used Instagram and Facebook, and that's 44. So that's what I'm going to go to next. So Instagram and Facebook, that would be this football right here. And we know that there are 44 total in this football shape. And we already counted 22 who use Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So we want to say the remaining ones used Instagram and Facebook, but not Twitter. So we've got 44 that I'm going to start with. And I subtract the 22 that we've already counted, and that gives me 22 for Instagram and Facebook, but not Twitter. And then I'll go to the next section, and this says 39 used Twitter and Facebook. So Twitter and Facebook would be this area. And we already counted 22 of those. So I'm going to subtract those 22 from the 39. And I get 17. So that's going to be 17 here. And then if I go back and look at this area, so this is Facebook or Twitter, there are 39 people total in that area. And that's what we have right here. So that makes sense. That's working. And next, we can look at 32 who used Instagram and Twitter. So Instagram and Twitter, that's this area, and it said 32. So 32 minus the 22 we've already counted gives me 10. So I have 10 who used Instagram and Twitter, but not Facebook. Okay, so we're about halfway done with our Venn diagram. And now I'm going to look at how many used each of the different forms of social media altogether. So we have 74 who used Facebook. I'm going to go ahead and erase this part, my little scratch pad here. So 74 used Facebook. That's this whole circle. This is 4 different sections. And it should add up to 74, and we've got 1 blank section. So I'm going to Facebook is, we have 22 plus 22 plus 17. And that adds up to 61. So now I'm going to subtract 61 from this 74 to find out how many used only Facebook. And that gives me 13. So 13 in that section. And I'll do the same thing for Twitter and Instagram. So let's start with Twitter. For Twitter, I have this circle, and there are 10, 22, and 17 in there already. So I'll just go ahead and add those up. And I have 49 total. So 54 minus 49 gives me 5. And that puts 5 in that area that is only Twitter. And now I'll go to Instagram. And in this circle, we already have 22 plus 22 plus 10. That adds up to 54. And we're going to subtract that from 69. We want that whole circle to add up to 69. And for that to happen, there would have to be 15 who used Instagram only. Okay. So we're almost done with our Venn diagram. But we do have one area left, and that's this outside area. People often call it the universal set, but it's really the part of the universal set that is outside all three of the sets. So since we know in the beginning it told us that there were 113 high school students in the survey, I'm going to take that 113 and I want to subtract the number that we've already counted. So I want to add up all the numbers that are in all three of these circles. So let's see what we have here. I have 15 plus 22 plus 13 plus 10, 22, 17, and 5. And that adds up to 104. So I'm going to subtract that 104 from the 113, and that means that there are 9 people who are not using any of those 3. And now I've got my whole Venn diagram filled in, and I'm ready to start answering the questions. So we haven't actually started any of the questions yet, but we're all set up for that. Okay, so I'm going to erase what I've written so far except for that Venn diagram, and then we'll go through the questions that we have listed here. Okay, so the first question says, how many of the students surveyed used only Instagram? So what I'm looking for, here's my circle of Instagram, but in this section, and this section, people used other forms of social media as well. So these people used also Facebook, these people used also Twitter, and these 22 used all 3. So I don't want to count any of those. I only want the 15 right here. So that's going to be 15. In the next question, it says, how many of the students surveyed used Instagram and Twitter, but not Facebook? Okay, so now I'm looking at Instagram and Twitter. So I'm looking for where do those two overlap, and that's here. But then I don't want them to use Facebook, so we don't want to use this 22 in the center. So that leaves me the 10 right here. Instagram, it's inside the circle of Instagram. It's inside the circle of Twitter. It's outside the circle of Facebook. So that's 10. Next, we have how many of the students surveyed used Instagram or Twitter. It doesn't say anything about Facebook. So that means they could use Facebook or they don't use Facebook, either way. So we just want to make sure they're inside the circle of Instagram and or inside the circle of Twitter. So either one. So I want everyone who's in the Instagram circle, everyone who's in the circle of Twitter. So I'm going to add those up. I don't want to add the center twice. So I'm just going to take 15 plus 22 plus 10 plus 22 plus 5 plus 17. So if I add those all together, then I get 91. So that's one way to approach that problem. There's actually a couple of ways to look at it. So while I was looking at the numbers and thinking, what are they going to add up to? What I actually did was I said, well, I want to add up these numbers. I want the numbers inside that red area. And so I looked at what numbers were not inside the red area. And I said, well, that's 9 plus 13. And that is 22. And then I just subtracted that from the total. I know that it adds up to 113. And that's how I got 91. So that's an alternate way of getting that answer. Okay. All right. In D, it says how many of the students used Instagram or Twitter but not Facebook. Let's see if I can erase that circle or shape, whatever it is. Okay. So how many used Instagram or Instagram or Twitter but not Facebook? So in this case, I paused for a second because I thought it was the same as B. But notice this says and this says or. So that makes a big difference. So now we want Instagram or Twitter. It could be Instagram, it could be Twitter, or it could be both. But we just want to make sure we're leaving out Facebook. So Instagram or Twitter, well, that was that area that we were just looking at. But then I don't want the ones that used Facebook. So I only want 15, 10, and 5. And that gives me 30. Okay, now we want to know how many of the students surveyed used exactly 2 of the social medias. So now I'm looking for anyone who used Instagram and Facebook but not Twitter. So that would be this area. That's 22 people who fall into that category. Or Instagram and Twitter but not Facebook. That's these 10. And then Facebook and Twitter but not Instagram would be these 17. So I'm going to add those 3 numbers together. And that adds up to 49. So that's how you do this problem.